And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is my second deck tech from March of the Machine. I had put a poll in the video for my top commanders from the set, and I let you guys vote, and it actually turned out to be a tie, ultimately, between Zimonin Dyna and Heliod the Radiant Dawn. This is the other deck tech that I will be making from March of the Machine. So, 2 white legendary enchantment creature god 4/4. When Heliod the Radiant Dawn enters the battlefield, return target enchantment card that isn't a god from your graveyard to your hand. That is an interesting ability, and I did go after that a little bit, and I'll explain why. Furthermore, though, we have 3 and a Phyrexian blue mana. Transform Heliod the Radiant Dawn, activate only as a sorcery. And of course, the back is probably more so what we want to be building around here. It certainly is the more interesting part. Heliod the Warped Eclipse, legendary enchantment creature, Phyrexian god, 4/6. You may cast spells as though they had flash, which of course is always going to be great, but spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card your opponents have drawn this turn. So I will first say a bunch of things about this commander. First of all, this backside you really can not build around at all and still have a pretty good commander here, right? Having a commander that is essentially a Vedalken Orrery is great. I can just cast my spells as though they had flash all the time. Fantastic. I just on my turn play my land for turn and then pass turn, and I can just react to whatever my opponents are doing. You could play a pretty great control deck with this commander, not building around this at all. Obviously, Azorius are great control colors. Also, spells you cast cost 1 less cast for each card your opponents have drawn this turn. That is something that your opponents are going to be doing all the time. So on your opponent's turns, because they're drawing at least 1 card on their draw step, your spells are always going to cost 1 less to cast, right? As long as you're doing it after they've drawn their card for turn. So at the very least, what this commander is I get to cast all my spells for 1 less, and I get to do it at instant speed. That's pretty fantastic. If you got some big spells in your hand that you want to cast, you just wait for your opponents to draw a bunch of cards, which of course people are doing in commander games all the time. So this really is a fantastic commander that you honestly could not build around at all, but of course I am going to build around it. Another important part that I mentioned in the spoiler video when I talked about this is, even though this is that god enchantment that we have seen before, this doesn't have indestructible, it doesn't have any sort of protection at all. It is both a creature and an enchantment. So of course it dies to those creature removal spells, those creature board wipes, also dies to the enchantment removal spells and the enchantment board wipes like a Bane of Progress. So that's not great. We have to protect our commander. That's a very, very important part that we have to build around here, I think. Now, going back to the front side, what I found when I was playtesting this deck is that when I cast my commander on, say, turn 4, I actually wanted to use that ability, right? The enter the battlefield ability. Why not get some advantage out of that, right? So there are cards in this deck that you will see, like Seal of Removal and Soul Snare, where it's like, okay, that seems like a weird inclusion in the deck. But the reason I put them in there is because they are enchantments that are probably going to end up in our graveyard pretty early in the game, that we can just get some value out of casting our commander, right? We're casting it anyway, it's entering the battlefield. Why not get an enchantment back into our hand that was put into the graveyard earlier in the game, right? Hesitation, Dress Down, these are pretty interesting enchantments that will likely end up in our graveyard early in the game that we can just reuse later on. Hesitation in particular I kind of like, because whenever a player casts a spell, you sacrifice it and counter that spell. So it's sort of a way to protect our commander, where we can slap it down on anyone casting a removal spell. Obviously, this will get sacrificed and counter it instead. Earlier in the game, we could just throw it down, right? If you have this in your opening hand, just play it on turn 2. Someone's going to cast into it eventually. If not, it'll slow the game down until you can get your commander out. You know, it's kind of a win-win situation, I think. Standstill is the one really interesting one that actually fits the theme of the deck. If you haven't seen it before, because it doesn't get played in commander much anymore, it used to get played all the time. 1 and a blue enchantment. Whenever a player casts a spell, sacrifice Standstill. If you do, each of that player's opponents draws 3 cards. So this is an interesting enchantment. We can throw it down early in the game. Someone is going to cast into it. It will get sacrificed. We get to draw 3 cards. So do the other opponents. That's fine. We can cast our Heliod, get it back into our hand so that we can use it again, which we want to, because of course we want our opponents to be drawing cards. So this actually does fit the theme of the deck, both the front and the back, which is pretty interesting. The protection, though, of course, is going to be really, really important here. I think Greater Oromancy might be the best option for for this. 1 and a white enchantment. Other enchantments you control have Shroud. Enchanted creatures you control have Shroud. So of course our commander is an enchantment creature. And I always like the protections that I can put down before my commander comes down. So I can play this, then cast my commander. As soon as it hits the table, it has Shroud. There is no window there for my opponents to try to get it off the table. Both the backside and the front side are an enchantment. So either the front or the back are going to have Shroud with Greater Oromancy in play. Bastion Protector as well is going to give our commander +2/+2 and indestructible. So again, a great way to protect our commander before we cast it, right? We're not giving our opponent a window to get rid of it here. As I say all the time, Tyrite Sanctum probably needs to go in more decks, because if your commander is a god and doesn't already have indestructible, and we got a bunch of those now, and this is a great way to protect our commander. It's a god. That's the creature type of our commander, so we don't have to do that first ability, right? Pay 2 and tap, target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types, put a +1/+1 counter on it. We can just skip over that, and we can go straight to the last one, pay 4 and tap, sacrifice Tyrite Sanctum, put an indestructible counter on target god. Our commander is already a god, so we can just pay 4, put an indestructible counter on our commander to make it harder to remove. One of my favorite old school cards that is great for protecting stuff in Azorius colors is Cloud Cover. 2 white and a blue enchantment. Whenever another permanent you control becomes the target of spell or ability an opponent controls, you may return that permanent to owner's hand. Now, this isn't the greatest thing in the world for protecting your commander, because of course, if it becomes the target of something, you have to return it to your hand and cast it again. But how is that not an advantage, right? This includes all of our permanents, by the way. Even if we have a land in play and our opponent attempts to ghost quarter it, that is a permanent we control that's becoming the target of an ability. We can then return it to our hand and just play it again next turn. This is really a fantastic card that you could put in any commander game, and at any point, if any of your stuff gets targeted by removal, you just return it to your hand so you can play it again at your leisure. Of course, with our commander, it's going to be extra important. It's not the best way in the world to protect our commander, but it is a neat way to do that. Also have Scion of Draco in this deck. People might see this and think it's a weird inclusion in the deck because, of course, it's a 12 mana artifact creature dragon. How does that fit in here? Well, it fits in here for a couple of reasons. First of all, this spell costs 2 less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. So, of course, we're going to have islands and plains in play, so this is going to cost 4 less. So it's only going to cost 8 mana. That's still a lot. There's 2 reasons I put this card in the deck. Most importantly, it's the abilities that it's giving. Each creature you control has vigilance if it's white, so of course our commander's white. It's going to have vigilance. That's all right. More importantly, though, hexproof if it's blue. So all of our white creatures are going to have vigilance, but hexproof if they're blue. So this gives our commander hexproof. Again, we want that protection. The reason I particularly went after this is because, as I said, I was playtesting this deck, and what I realized is you're going to get into those situations where your opponents have drawn a whole bunch of cards on their turn, and what ends up happening is any colorless spell, so any spell that's just costing generic mana, is going to be free, right? Your commander is reducing the generic cost of your spells. So having less colored mana symbols in your cards is going to mean you can cast more, right? If I cast, say, a Windfall, for example, which I do have in this deck, my opponents have now drawn 21 cards. That means all of my spells are going to cost 21 generic mana less to cast, which means any of my spells that are only generic mana are entirely free. It doesn't matter if they cost 12 mana or 8 or whatever. I can cast it at instant speed for free. So I tried to load up with the heavy generic costed things, and of course those are going to be artifacts, right? I got Meteor Golem and Cityscape Leveler in here, great removal options, and it is entirely likely that these will just be free, right? Being able to destroy permanents for free is pretty good. I got Reaver Titan and Portal to Phyrexia in here as well. Great artifacts that we got last year that are also great finishers as well. And again, likely is going to be free for us to cast. You know, when we draw a whole ton of cards, we are going to have some things that we want to use that colored mana for. So it's going to be really tough for us to really take advantage of the fact that our spells are costing an incredible amount less. So if we have 2 or 3 or 4 colorless spells in our hand, we can just cast that stuff for free. We don't have to use any of our colored mana. So I loaded up with a lot of that stuff. Of course, the stuff that is drawing everybody cards like Prosperity are going to be great here, especially because it has that X. Again, the generic mana is going to cost a lot less. If we've Windfalled, our spells are going to cost 21 less mana, assuming we have 3 opponents. So that means for just 1 blue mana, we can now Prosperity for 21, and each player draws 21 1 cards, right? So now, I mean, I don't even want to get into the situation of how much our spells are going to cost less. Essentially, all of our spells are going to be only costing the colored mana. Again, that's why I like having those big, expensive, colorless spells in here. Of course, we're also drawing a whole bunch of cards as well. So now we're filling our hand, we're casting a bunch of stuff, right? That is certainly one of the directions I went with this deck, just having everybody draw a bunch of cards at once. I don't want to give my opponents, though, too big of an advantage. Letting your opponent draw a ton of cards obviously can be a disadvantage as well. I got Memory Jar and Magus of the Jar in here, though. These, I think, are quite a bit better. Memory Jar obviously is colorless, so it's very likely we'll just be able to flash it out for free. Magus of the Jar, of course, is the creature version of this, but I like these options because you're going to make everyone essentially set aside their hand, right? They're going to exile their hand face down and then draw 7 cards, right? So you're making all your opponent, including yourself, draw 7 cards. Now, of course, we can cast everything with flash, so we can do this on our opponent's turn, on our turn. Really doesn't matter when we do it, but it's going to be giving our opponents all those draw triggers without really giving them a huge advantage because, of course, our opponents can't cast stuff with flash, likely anyway. So all the cards they're drawing, right? If anyone's ever used a Memory Jar in a Commander game before, your opponents don't really take that big of an advantage of it because they're just going to draw a bunch of cards and then those cards are going to get discarded on the end step and they're just going to get their normal hand back. So really you are taking a huge advantage of this because, of course, you get to cast the spells that you're drawing with these effects, but also your opponents are drawing a bunch of cards. So it's a win-win for us. I really like the stuff, though, that is just going to be giving the couple of draws, though. We don't need to do the big windfall type of effects all the time. Like Zenith Chronicler, I think, is a pretty good fit in this deck. It is that 2-mana artifact creature that we are very likely going to be casting for free very easily. Whenever a player casts their first multicolored spell each turn, each other player draws a card. So if we cast a multicolored spell, all of our opponents get to draw a card. Now, all of our spells are costing 3 less to cast. That's pretty good, right? If one of our opponents cast a multicolored spell, now we have 2 opponents drawing cards, so all of our spells are going to cost 2 less to cast, and then we get to draw a card as well. So I think that's a pretty good fit in the deck. Lore Broker, I really like this one a lot. 1 and a blue human rogue, 1/2, tap each player draws a card, then discards a card. Again, this is not giving a huge advantage to anyone here. Your opponents are going to end up with the same amount of cards in hand, but each player is drawing a card here, so all 3 of your opponents are drawing and then discarding. They still end up with the same amount of cards in hand, but now all of our spells are going to cost 3 less to cast for this turn. Vizian Skynes and Words of Wisdom. Again, these are not these huge, splashy, everyone draws a ton of cards type of effects, but they are really good here. Keep in mind, on our opponent's turn, they're going to draw a card, so now all of our spells cost 1 less to cast, so both of these are only going to cost 1 blue mana. That's not much at all, right? And Vizian Skynes is going to make each player draw 2 cards, so now again, if all 3 of our opponents have drawn 2 cards, and then of course that opponent whose turn it is has drawn a card for turn already, we're now up to 7 already. Just with this card, 7 mana is going to be reduced from the spells we are casting. Words of Wisdom, you draw 2 cards, then each other player draws a card, so now we're going to get 2 card draws off of this, but again, it's going to make all of our spells cost 3 less to cast. Pretty good. Cut a Deal and Secret Rendezvous are great white options for this, where both us and our opponents are drawing, so we're getting the advantage of drawing, and then we're also getting the advantage of our spells costing a lot less, right? Secret Rendezvous is a card that I probably am never going to play in a Commander deck again because I think white has great card draw options, but this is an opportunity for us to have an opponent draw 3 cards. Now our spells are going to cost 3 less for the turn, and then we get to draw 3 cards as well. So I think it actually works here. Let's talk about those win cons. And of course, we do have the big splashy artifact creatures and whatnot that we can be playing. That is one way we can win with this deck. We also can win by drawing out our opponents. That is an option here. We can cast a spell like Fascination, for example, having each player draw X cards, or each player puts top X cards in their library into a graveyard. Of course, we have to be careful doing this to ourselves. I do have Campfire in the deck, which is going to get our commander out of the command zone. Of course, that's great, but it also shuffles our graveyard into our library, right? So we don't have to worry about drawing ourselves to death or milling ourselves out. It is an option. You can just draw everyone out with this deck. Another option, of course, is we punish our opponents for having big hands with cards like Black Vice and Iron Maiden. Both of these cards are going to punish our opponents for having too many cards in hand, right? Or a lot of cards in hand. And it is likely that on our opponent's turn, when that Iron Maiden triggers, right, it's going to deal 1 1 damage to that player for each card in their hand more than 4, and our opponent could likely have 20 cards in hand. So Iron Maiden could be dealing 16 damage to that player, right? Cards like this really can close out the game pretty darn quickly. Of course, I got Psychosis Crawler as well. Again, another generically costed colorless card that we are likely going to be casting for free. And of course, it wants us to have lots of cards in our hand and be drawing lots of cards, which we will obviously be doing. So another way we can be closing out the game, it is likely, and in fact, very easily, that we can win this game without attacking at all. There is several options in this deck for winning without any attacking going on, which is why I threw a very fun, interesting card in this deck, Maishin the Mind Cage. I just threw Faces of the Past in my Zamon and Dyna deck. That's a card I've been looking for a neat little spot for it for a long time. Here's another crazy blue enchantment that I've been looking for a neat deck to throw in, and I think this is one. 4 blue legendary enchantment. So I don't love the 3 blue, but it is very likely that we'll be only paying the 3 blue to cast this. That's not bad. All creatures get -X/-0, where X is the number of cards in your hand. And again, we're going to have a lot of cards in our hand, right? It's likely that we're going to have at least 7, and we will probably have even more than that. So this is essentially just going to shut off every creature, right? Nobody will be able to win with combat damage as long as this guy is in play. In fact, it's entirely likely that even if your opponent casts like a Craterhoof Behemoth type of effect, you're going to have like 15 cards in hand, and even that is not even going to do anything. This can completely shut off any combat damage sort of wins. And again, we can very easily win in this deck without doing so. Another neat inclusion in the deck that I thought was a perfect fit is Parallel Thoughts. Again, another card that I have mentioned before a couple of times that I think is a pretty neat fit in a couple of different decks if you got a lot of draw triggers, right? And it is essentially a tutor option if you do have those draw triggers. And here's why. It's an enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for 7 cards. Exile them in a face down pile and shuffle that pile. Then shuffle your library. So you're searching your deck for 7 cards, right? Any 7 cards you want. Can be some sort of combo enabling scenario. Any win cons you want to look for in your deck. If you would draw a card, you may instead put the top card of the pile you exiled with Parallel Thoughts into your hand. So you're getting a random card from that pile, right? But we have so many effects in this deck, like those windfall or prosperity type of effects, where we're just going to be drawing a whole ton of cards all at once, that essentially what Parallel Thoughts turns into is 5 mana, go tutor for 7 cards and put them into your hand. If I Parallel Thoughts and go get 7 cards and then windfall immediately after that, I'm now just going to take those 7 cards I just got with my Parallel Thoughts and put them directly into my hand. Seems pretty good in this deck, right? I think Parallel Thoughts is a very underrated inclusion in any deck where you're getting lots of those draw triggers, because you can very easily get those exiled cards into your hand. And there is my Heliod the Radiant Dawn deck. I think it's a pretty interesting commander for sure, and absolutely has the potential to be a high-powered one as well. Again, I went in a few different directions here. Of course, I do want my opponents to be drawing. I want to be taking advantage of that as much as I can by putting lots of these generically costed spells in my deck so I can cast them for free. And you could probably go down that road even more so, I imagine. And I even put some of those enchantments in the deck that we can get back out of the graveyard as well. Really interesting commander. And if you are interested in it at all, I have the deck list in the description below. Feel free to check it out for yourself. But that is it for today. And thanks for tuning in.